Firstly, all my sessions really center around advocacy, but the sessions tomorrow center around, I guess, more an educational or informational base. Today, this is an educators conference, not an advocates conference. There's a whole big difference between education and advocacy. So, what's the point? What is the point of advocacy? Yeah?
Defending things that you think, or promoting things, or raising awareness of things that you feel are important.
Okay, is there a point to doing Israel advocacy? People feel like there's no point. Sometimes people feel like, yeah.
Nowadays, even more than ever, because we know that the media and the communication devices that have a lot of information about, say, the other side. I mean, we are in work, but very little about the reality of what is in Israel, why is it there, and the rights of having the state. All that is not known.
Okay, why should it be known?
Because
it'll make you feel good, but why else should it be known?
No.
Okay.
We're talking about existence here. We're talking about being able to exist and have the same right just like in our country.
Okay.
I think just on the back of that, I'd suggest that it's a clarification for ourselves, but also for the wider community, especially when we open up something like the Sydney Morning Herald and we see a cartoon of obviously a Jewish man with the kippah with the big nose, with the at the back, with the remote control, just willy-nilly blowing up whatever's going on in Gaza. So I think the balance and the reason, I might avoid the word justification, but the reasons why this is happening needs to be explained because there are a lot of people who just don't know. Jewish people as well.
Okay.
But also as educators, we have the responsibility to teach the students the facts and also to support Israel. As students in a Jewish school, if the ethos of the school or the philosophy of the school supports Israel, as educators we have the responsibility to do so.
Okay.
We also have a responsibility to be a gadfly, like Socrates was, on the butt of this particular issue. That is probably why we're all in this session. We can't let the bullshit fly. And my goal when I'm on Facebook and on every single session, I want the facts to rise, and I want this propaganda hasbara to sink. So I will push that and push it and push it.
I don't see advocacy as something that we do only in crisis, like what happened in the past one. Advocacy is something that you do every day, in my perspective. And advocacy is basically education about Israel. So it's not necessarily about Palestinian versus Israelis or Gaza versus Israelis. What Israel is, this is advocacy.
Absolutely.
I don't know, for me it's a very big question because I'm used to argue and to think of lots of perspectives and to be in a position of, and I'm asking myself, what is my role? Do I need to present just one point of view? Do I need to raise the questions? Do I need, and advocacy in some way, the connotation for me is to only show one point of view in opposition to education.
So that's really important. That's why I said at the beginning, there is a difference between advocacy and between advocacy and education. So, I'm not an educator. I think that one of the things that we do is advocate. The question is how narrow or wide can be the point that you're saying. It's a narrative. But going back to this lady's first point, there's two reasons to be an advocate, or there's two reasons to have advocacy, and not everybody can be an advocate. Some people just have to say, I'm troubled by too many questions. I'll be an educator, I can't be an advocate. The first one is that it is an existential thing. The fact is, Israel cannot survive without her allies. It's a fact. We might wish it otherwise, but it can't. And advocacy, one of advocacy's role is to keep the allies on side. The second point is that, and I've said this, it's been I've posited this for a couple of decades already, that almost most of our community is almost personally in a post-halakhic era. They live in a post-halakhic era, How they see Israel will determine whether they want to be Jewish or not. Not whether they want to go on Aliyah or not, but that will affect how they see the Jewish collective. What Jews, when they have power, the power to actually decide. For 2,000 years, we had no responsibility. It was never our fault. We couldn't do anything. We were powerless. Now, however, we have the rights, but also the obligations to make decisions. And what Jews do now, when we run a country, will affect, I believe, how other Jews, whether they'll want to be part of the collective or not. So, if we just look, and the aura is 100% correct, and I want to talk about that advocacy, you cannot jump from crisis to crisis, and you cannot advocate differently from each crisis to the next crisis. Nevertheless, we deal a lot with crises. There were 3 phases to the current crisis. The 3 boys were kidnapped, they wore kippot, they were kidnapped over the Green Line, and for the first time in the last 2 or 3 decades, they were not issues. Everybody throughout Israel, as a collective, held their breath for the fate of these boys. It was a unity that we haven't seen. In Israel, they say Tel Aviv and Jerusalem were the same. There's a sort of a picture. This is a unique event in the last 20 years, in my view. Then we had the first period, the rockets, Iron Dome, which gave the government of Israel the luxury, in inverted commas, of restraint. And we were doing very well in PR at this point in time. Now, I know people here won't agree with me, but in my view, even now, in this current crisis, Israel's image has been better than at any other time, or less worse, if you want to look at it that way, than at any other time. I hope to discuss that a little bit further. Then we had the ground incursions. Let's not know if, we're not going to discuss if they knew about all the tunnels, they didn't know about all the tunnels. But those tunnels added to the unity inside Israel. And in Israel, there wasn't a discussion about the morality, the necessity of this battle. That hasn't happened. It didn't happen in Cast Lead. It didn't happen in Pillars of Defense. It didn't happen in the war in Lebanon. It didn't happen in the current generation that's fighting. Now, in terms of public relations, as I say, we've had a better run now. Even the Herald, which we all love to hate, right? It wasn't the front page of the Herald. It was inside the Herald. Australia, Canada, United States, Britain, France and Germany, most of the time, were directly, openly behind Israel. We had for the first time a moderate Sunni alliance quite publicly behind Israel. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates. And the press was either pretty good, if you like watching Fox and reading The Australian, or less bad if you actually read the Herald. And if you think it's not, you've got to look back what the Herald wrote in previous times. And it was generally accepted that Hamas were the aggressors and that Israel was defending herself. The question asked was, not why does Israel have to defend herself, but why does Israel have to kill so many civilians to do so? And that is a whole sea change difference from previous conflicts. Now, tragically, and you know, the shooting down of MH17 helped us as well. It diverted attention, and I'm only surprised that we haven't heard that it was Israel that shot the plane down to divert attention from what was going on in Gaza. The question from Hamas, where is Goldstone? Which they asked repeatedly. Now, they are getting Goldstone, but coming later from a different source. What was Goldstone? Goldstone was a Jew. You didn't get yet, at this stage, inside Israel, the calls for Goldstone, or the calls for the inquiry. More, there were calls for inquiry about why we didn't know about the tunnels, why we should leave or not leave, but not about the question that was raised in Cast Lead. And the fact is that when there's unity in Israel, and it doesn't mean 100%, all right, but we're talking about a vast, broad consensus, there's unity here. We didn't get the internal dissent. In an advocacy sense, we didn't have such a problem advocating in this particular crisis. Now, Netanyahu, in my view, this was the highest point of his career. In terms of his conduct, and we're talking here in terms of the conduct of the nation. I'm not talking about the military conduct. I don't know anything by that. being hit by the right wing, in inverted commas, because as you'll hear me tomorrow if you come, I don't believe there is a right or a left wing as such. But being hit by the right helps your image in a public relations sense. You know, when Shimon Peres says we have to bomb Iran, it's taken differently by the world than when Naftali Bennett says we have to bomb Iran. So it's not only what's said, it's who says what and to what audience. For the first time, Israel had clear and minimal aims. It made limited aims. And they made very clear they did not want to reoccupy Gaza, they did not want to bring Hamas down, they just wanted to defend Israeli citizens. That makes advocacy much easier. But an advocate, and here comes to some of the questions, an advocate can't make policy. That's not the role of an advocate. It's not to say you can't be involved in making policy, but an advocate doesn't make policy. An ambassador, and Danny will back me up with this, you go to the Israeli ambassador's office. Sometimes, you know, we used to joke because in Israel, with the shortage of leaders, they just kept changing them. So there used to be one photo frame with the same guys on either side, and the one ambassador, when one prime minister gets elected, turns the photo around. Then when the next guy comes back again, turns the photo back, and he has to then start defending the policy of the new government. That's an advocate. Ambassadors don't make policy. We are, if you're an advocate, mini ambassadors. But you have to sell a common message. The other side is extremely good, whether you believe what their message is or you don't, at selling a common message. And our problem is to distill that message, that narrative. And advocates just don't sell their own personal policies. Then you're not an advocate. You can be an agitator, you can be an activist, but you're not an advocate. This is not the first war, this is not the last war. And that's why, if you advocate differently every time there's a crisis, your message is lost, or your narrative is not understood. So we need to have that common narrative. And can that PR point, or that narrative, can you find that to be quite consistent through whatever pretty much comes along? I believe it can. I want to use an example of the disengagement to show how, in my view, the difference between an advocate and between good and bad advocacy. So the disengagement that took place, there was an advertisement in the Australian Jewish News by 30-something rabbis saying that the disengagement was against halakha and calling on soldiers to disobey the orders of the army. Here in Australia, it's sort of a bit odd, but not too many serving Israeli soldiers sitting here in Australia. There was another argument was it was a non-democratic decision. Another argument was now from the left-hand side saying it's an end to the occupation, apartheid's the reason we have to get out. In my view, the left and the right, as advocates, damaged Israel. Because if Israel makes non-democratic decisions, it undermines our whole concept that Israel's a democracy. If you're going to fight the political battle through the soldiers, you're undermining the army's ability to carry out the policy of whatever the government may be, or the government decision may be, and so on and so forth. So one of the rules of advocacy is to do no harm, and to think about what you're saying today that might come back to bite you the next time. But if you want to advocate against the disengagement in a positive sense, talk about the security risks of Israel. How is the risk, the security, the damage to Israel's security in getting out, the risks that Israel's taking. Use about, whether you agree with it or not, Israel's sincerity when it talks about a two-state solution. Here's a positive example. Israel's willingness to compromise. I mean, these are positive advocacy points rather than the previous ones, which in my view just damaged the advocacy whole thing. Now, yes, we know about moral equivalence. Yes, Arabs can be killing Arabs, Muslims can be killing Arabs. But so what? It doesn't sell as a PR point. We've never gone to a minister in this country or a prime minister and asked the question, why is Israel doing X, Y, Z? And we say, oh, but look, they're worse. It just doesn't sell. So we can tell that to ourselves. We can write numerous articles to each other. Look how the world is ignoring some other... Okay, so what? As an advocate, it's a useless point. It's almost a compliment. It's almost also anti-Semitic, but it's almost a compliment because they expect more from us, but really it's a moral bankruptcy. We know that. But frankly, I don't mind being held to a higher standard than any of Israel's neighbours. We don't always get to pick our fights. Look, I'm sure some of you watch Lateline. Emma Alberici. Yeah? You watch Lateline? Anybody? No? Yeah? Okay, thanks. Channel 2. Right? She is an excellent interviewer. She's neither for us nor against us. She's the reason why I say this time we got much better press or much less bad press. One night she had on Mustafa Barghouti, the next night she had Dori Gold. If you watched her body language halfway through the Mustafa Barghouti interview, she was laughing. She was just smiling. She was incredulous. She said, but you know, Hamas is firing rockets from hospitals and schools. He said, no. That's an Israeli lie. She said, but the United Nations says that. He said, no. She just gave up. If you watch that interview, look at her attitude. Next night, she had Dori Gold on. Now, he's an excellent advocate, but that aside, she didn't ask Dori Gold, why is Israel the aggressor in this war? She didn't ask Dori Gold, why is Israel attacking poor Gazans? She asked Dori Gold, why, when Israel has the complete right to defend itself, when Hamas was the aggressor, does Israel have to kill so many civilians? That's again a very different starting point. And we haven't been at that starting point, not in 2012, not in 2006, and not in many other times beforehand. It's very hard to fight pictures of dead bodies, particularly dead children. Hamas wanted that ground incursion. They needed that ground incursion. Hamas were drawing Israel in, and as much as Netanyahu tried to stay out, he had no choice in the end that he went in. That's why Hamas never agreed to a ceasefire with Israel still outside of Gaza. It wasn't paying PR dividends for them. And also because that's where they're most effective at fighting. And one has to admit that they did they're very effective fighters. The IDF's moral action is no match for pictures of civilians dying. You can try and justify that any way you like. You can talk as much as you like about leaflets being dropped, about warning shots being given. In today's age, unless you have an hour to sit down and talk to everybody, you are going to have a very tough time. So yes, we say all of those things. But it goes over to, the answer comes back, but why do you have to kill so many? Surely they all can't be against you. Surely, surely, surely. Now, our allies, again, I say to you, Israel can only fight a war for a limited time without allies. As great as Sahal is, as great as whatever and whatever, we have limited capability. And our allies, not our enemies, our allies demand proportionality from us when they don't even demand it from themselves. Yes, that's correct. Yes, we should try and change that, but it's another fact that we have to deal with as advocates. Our allies are sensitive to images. Hamas's aim is an existential threat to wedge us from our allies, because if you separate us from our allies, God forbid, Israel falls. Now, I know people like to hate Obama. You know, the most openly anti-Semitic president of the United States saved Israel. You know, if you remember, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was an anti-Semite, proud of it. He had a Jewish Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. On the third or fourth day of the Yom Kippur War, when it looked like Israel was going to be annihilated, Henry Kissinger, the Jewish Secretary of State, advised the Americans to do nothing. Nixon, the anti-Semite, decided to save the state of Israel in the biggest airlift of weaponry to that point in time in the history of airlifts. Not only that, and I'm going to say it, yeah, down here, not only that, there wasn't a single European country that allowed American planes to land at American ports to refuel on their way to rearm Israel. Now, if you really think By the way, I don't want to remind you how many people were killed in the Yom Kippur War. We lost over 2,500 soldiers from a population that was a fraction of the size that it is today. If you really think that we're in a bad position today, you haven't bothered to look back at the recent history. Obama, when Israel decided not to go ahead with Iron Dome after Lebanon, and Amir Peretz was pushing it, Obama paid for that. Well, an American taxpayer paid for that, but you need a presidential decision to pay for that. Midway during this crisis, Qatar decided to send $400 million to pay the salaries of the Hamas employees inside Gaza. Obama, through his people, contacted the Arab Bank, and they said, you deliver that money, the Arab Bank's assets will be frozen in the United States, and no American company will be allowed to deal with you. The money's still in the Arab Bank. It didn't get there. Now, the resupply, there's an argument now going on in the press whether Obama was for or against the resupply. But as Obama was speaking negatively about Israel, the American government was resupplying Israel with shells, with ammunition, and so forth. And, you know, Iron Dome saved lives. You know, it's not just a little thing. It saved potentially thousands of lives. You can't just write that off. It was a miracle. Aside from the strategic advantage it gave Israel to have the time to think and so forth. And frankly, it's much better to be fighting a PR battle with fewer Israeli casualties than having good PR with, God forbid, thousands of Israeli deaths. We don't always get to choose. Now, Michael Eason is a significant member of the Labor Party in New South Wales. When the New South Wales Labor Party passed a resolution at the instigation of Carr recently, Michael Eason spoke from the floor defending Israel and speaking against the thing. But this is how he describes the problem that we have. Israel is both Goliath and David. You know, we're used to being the victim. We're not used to being the other side, but now we're both, depending on how you describe the situation. We're both the little guy and the giant. And that's a very difficult public image. The image of Goliath is used against us, right? The image of the underdog plays for us. Are we the underdog? We believe we're the underdog. Are the Gazans portrayed as the underdog? It's a very difficult image, and this is somebody on our side, but this is how he sees the problem of advocacy for the State of Israel. Is he advocating for Goliath or for David? Now, Julie Bishop, there's absolutely no doubt that she's one of our best supporters, correct? She says she knows no law that will make the settlements illegal. She declares East Jerusalem to not be occupied territory. And yet, Julie Bishop, and this is the reason why Bibi Netanyahu got out of Gaza, not because of Julie Bishop specifically, but pulled the troops out of Gaza, but why he could no longer carry out a war. 10 days ago, this is what Julie Bishop said, our close friend. Israel has a right to defend itself and must take all necessary steps to prevent civilian casualties. Okay. We acknowledge that the underlining is by me, hundreds of innocent civilians have been killed in Gaza since the conflict began. This is one of our closest friends and allies. There have been a number of shocking incidents, her words, not mine, including the indefensible shelling of 3 UN schools. That last shelling of the school, now, whether it did happen or it didn't happen, whatever, in an advocacy sense, it damaged us greatly. But the most shocking is the last paragraph. Australia will support calls for a full investigation into these incidents, declaring both Israel and Hamas must respect international humanitarian law. Our best friends are now seeing us the same as Hamas, or not the same, but putting us in the same category. This echoed around the world. The Prime Minister of Britain, the President of France, President Obama. That's pressure, notwithstanding internal Israeli politics, that no Israeli Prime Minister can ignore. Is it fair? It's not a question of what's fair. You asking a question? Oh, sorry. No, at the back. Don't go to auctions. So Israel withdrew because it can't survive without her allies. The West supports Israel's right to defend herself as long as she's got one hand tied behind her back. Okay. But that's the situation we're in. And now both sides, I'm talking about Hamas and Israel, need to be able to paint a victory for this current bout to stop. But remember, this is just a step, a stage. So what are the messages of this war? It's an existential threat. That's our message, right? It's not about sharing. We're willing to share. It's not about peace. We're willing to make peace. It's not about justice. It's not about morality. It's not about occupation. But it's much better to be positive, to be calm, and to sound reasonable. In a lot of the advocacy that we do, most of the people we speak to do not remember what we said. They do remember how we appeared, how we sounded. Do we sound reasonable? Do we sound calm? Do we sound like we want to share? Remember, the whole basis for the State of Israel in the international community is Resolution 181 of the United Nations, where we agreed to have a Jewish state and an Arab state. There were no Palestinians then. It was an Arab state. So is our narrative that broad, and we can fit everything into that narrative? In my view, yes, it should be for advocates. Always want, whether you think there should be a Palestinian state or not be a Palestinian state. You've got a view on that? Express it, but you're not an advocate. Go to Israel. Go and vote. Create your own party. Do whatever you want. But you're not an advocate. Because the policy of every government of Israel is United Nations Resolution 181. The other advocacy point is to globalise this whole thing. It's not Israel against a few Palestinians. It's Israel fighting the West's war against evil. Most people that we meet in Australian politics and journalists don't really believe anybody can be evil. There's that great cartoon, you know, you've got Hamas sitting on one side, Bibi on the other, John Kerry in the middle, and Hamas says, we want to kill all the Jews. And John Kerry turns to Bibi and says, can you meet them at least halfway? They just don't believe in evil. They don't believe that there is a group that just say, all we want to do is kill you. Now, ISIS, however, helps. We need to link Hamas and ISIS together, if you want to be an advocate, that they're both totalitarian fascist entities. Israel sits as the only state of order in a sea of disorder. Disorder is harmful to the world balance. Globalise it. Israel is leading the fight of order against disorder, of human rights against human abuses. How does, we all know the question, we ask the same question, how does the left today align itself with the most fascist, anti-woman, anti-gay movement that there happens to be? Of morality against immorality. So the overall message can be distilled into three very simple concepts to state, very difficult concepts to actually employ. But one is, we're about a Jewish state. Two is, we're about democracy. And the third is, we're about security. That's the advocacy tripod. Now, how we achieve all of those things, and I use this in everything I talk about, you can, in anything. That's the message of Israel from its founding day till today. How we achieve them, that's the question. That's tactics though. That's not the goal. The goal is to get to this sort of thing. Now, some people will achieve that by making Israel smaller. Some people will achieve that by making Israel bigger. Jewish state democracy, frankly, friends, you need to make Israel smaller. Security, you might need to make Israel bigger. But you can fit into that advocacy paradigm talking about those issues and how we're striving for that outcome. And then the dilemmas come in as to how we deal with those dilemmas. Tomorrow I've got a slide from Rabbi Doniel Hartman about the whole paradox of what a Jewish state means. But that's just for another time. Now, Danny, I think, sent me, till now, we haven't debated the Palestinian lobby here. Till now, we've made our comments, they've made their comments. I'm a dentist like Danny, I don't work on Wednesdays, so I was informed on Tuesday afternoon that I was going to debate a Palestinian on Wednesday morning on a program called, it's a Triple M program, called the Grill Team. I assumed, because I'm not in that demographic that listens to this program, that the Grill Team meant they were going to grill you. It turns out it's 3 footballers standing around a barbecue grill talking about what's happened during the week. Now, the guy on the far left is Matthew Geyer. You can't really tell here, but he's almost a foot taller than me. His arms are about the size of my legs. And he was always in the front row, if you follow rugby league. He was in the front row, and whenever they wanted to physically maim a member of the other team, they sent him on. He was the enforcer. And as I'm sitting outside the studio watching them talking, he's going, yeah. The show finishes, he comes out, he's the most erudite, educated, intelligent person, polite, it's like completely, he's an act, right? So the first person they put up, they suggested we debate, is a guy called Zaki Malka, who just so happens that Sam Tataka, those of you who know Sam from Victoria, sent a video of this guy around to us just 5 days before. He's in Syria with his head covered saying, "You Australian Jews, I'm coming to get you. I'm coming to get you. I'm coming back from Syria. I'm coming to get you." They had no idea who they're going on. They asked him. He's back here. He served 2 years in prison in Australia for terrorist-related activities. He's now a free man. And so I said, look, I don't think that that's an appropriate person for Triple M to interview. Have a look at this link. They looked at the link and they said, yeah, we're not going to have this guy. So they then came up with Randa Abdel Fattah. She's a Melbourne-based lawyer. She's supposedly one of their best people. This is now, you can all tear me apart shortly, but this is now the only debate that's taken place between an Australian Jewish representative and a Palestinian. It was 28 minutes. It was edited by the station down to 12. We're going to hear the whole thing. And it was edited extremely fairly. The station was very fair about what they did. It was pre-recorded, right? Obviously it was edited. That afternoon in Sydney occurred that bus incident, which moved this debate from being 6:30 a.m. to the prime time of the show, and some introduction. Now, you'll hear the introduction by the guy on the far right. He's the brains of the outfit, despite his grin. He did the intro, and I'll talk a little bit more about it afterwards. But if you want to be an advocate, you can be an unsuccessful advocate as well, that's quite the case, to a demographic that know nothing about the topic, right? Remember what I was trying to say before. Whether we sound calm, whether we sound sharing, whether we sound peaceful, because all that will rub off onto the image of what Israel might be. So let's listen to this, and then we'll take that from where we do. There's no visuals, it's a radio program.
The Triple M Grill Team. Turn Gus, MG and Lenny on 6 to 9 weekdays.
Yes, boys, hate bus. Thugs threaten to slit Jewish pupils' throats. The ugly Middle East conflict arrived in Sydney's east yesterday, and MG brought it up with Maddie only a few days ago. You know, it's so far away, how can we be affected by it? Well, MG, it's right here now, mate, on Sydney buses. It's a disgrace. Let me go through it. Sydney's east yesterday, courtesy of a group of louts who stormed a bus full of Jewish school children and threatened to slit their throats while yelling, "Kill the Jews and free Palestine." Children as young as 5 were terrorised by 8 young men after they boarded the bus at Randwick about 4 p.m. They were screamed at, "Hail Hitler, Palestine must kill you Jews," just all very bad anti-Semitic stuff.
Yeah, well, to give you some brief history of what's actually happened overseas, and we're going to get the opinions, and they are just opinions of a couple of local Sydney experts on this in just a moment, but this goes back to a portion of land in Palestine. It all began with mass Jewish immigration there in the late 1800s. In 1947, the UN got involved and recommended giving away 55% of the Palestinian land to a Jewish state, and that resulted in a 2-year war. There was another war in 1967 in which Israel seized control of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and as we've seen in the last month or so, the conflict continues with no foreseeable resolution. 1,834 Palestinians and 67 Israelis have been killed so far in the recent dispute. We would like to get both sides of the argument here, and we have a few special guests this morning in the studio. Local Jewish community leader, Dr. Ron Weiser. Dr. Weiser, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
And on the line as well, we have Palestinian Australian Randa Abdel Fattah. Randa, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Yes, Randa, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to go ladies first on this particular one. Lots of ourselves in here and also our listeners just would like to get their different views from both sides. So if you could explain to us exactly where you're coming from, and then we'll have Dr. Ron to give his side, and then we'll have a bit of a chat where everyone can have a discussion, if that's all right.
Well, just starting basically first with what's happening in Gaza and this sort of barbaric massacre of Palestinians, I feel that it really just is further proof of Israel's lust for violence. The Israeli narrative has been, that Palestinians want to die, that they're, either martyrs or they stage their deaths or they're engaged in human shields. But all the evidence points to the fact that Israel is the military occupying power, has huge force compared to a weak and defenceless population. And the statistics are evidence enough of what the Palestinians are up against. Over 1,800 Palestinian civilians, 90% of those are civilians, 400 children dead. It's really tragic, and I think that we need to remember when we're trying to understand what's happening over there, because so often people think that it's some sort of symmetrical conflict, that there are two equal parties, that they both have equal and legitimate rights and claims. What we have to understand is that the Palestinian people are dispossessed of their land since 1947 and have been under military occupation since 1967. And that's an occupation that's illegal according to United Nations Security Council. And we really need to see more international pressure so that the Palestinians can enjoy the same rights that we all enjoy: freedom, dignity and justice.
Thank you very much, Randa. That was comprehensive. Dr. Ron.
So really, what's going on at the moment is a microcosm of what's been happening there for the last century. The United Nations decided that the Jewish people and the Palestinian people, at that time the Arab people, should share that piece of land. The Jewish people accepted it, the Palestinian Arab people did not accept it, and there's been conflict ever since. Still today, Israel got out of Gaza in 2005. The Palestinians the following year elected a government in their only fair and free elections they've ever had there, called Hamas. Hamas is completely dedicated, publicly, openly, to the complete eradication of the Jewish state. And until the Palestinian leadership is going to come forward and say it's willing to share that piece of land, that the state of Israel can live alongside a Palestinian state, there's not going to be a resolution to the conflict. The reason that there are so many civilian casualties on the Palestinian side or in Gaza, and it's an absolute tragedy, but we have to find out where the cause of that lies. Israel builds missiles to protect its civilians, and Hamas uses civilians to protect its missiles. The disproportionate number of deaths is only because Hamas is willing to use human shields, because Hamas is not willing to protect its own people. And let's face it, the whole way that this current bout of fighting started was because Hamas rained down thousands and thousands of rockets on the civilian population of Israel. No government can tolerate it, no Australian government will tolerate it. Imagine if you left next door to a neighbour and all he's doing is throwing missiles over your fence, and then when you go over to talk to him about it, he holds his baby in front of him and says, you can't punch me now because I'm holding my baby. I mean, it's just a ridiculous analogy to say that one side, that the Israeli side, doesn't care about human life. Israel does more than any other army in the world to act to minimise civilian casualties. It drops leaflets, it tells people where to go, it gives warnings. The Israeli army carries with it, every unit carries a lawyer with it so that it can advise it on human rights issues and so forth. Ironically, so few people have been killed, but any death is appalling, and the real blame has to go back to the Hamas, who refused to make an agreement with Israel to live in peace side by side.
Okay, that was Dr. Ron Weiser. Now, Randa, you've heard Dr. Ron. What are your thoughts there?
Wow, so 1,800 people is minimal. What I'd like to know with this sort of propaganda is what would a restrained attack look like? I mean, are we talking about nuking Gaza? I mean, when you look at the statistics, the death toll, the absolute decimation of medical supplies, hospitals being bombed, schools being bombed, neighbourhoods being shattered. What would a restrained attack look like? I mean, what's so funny about the Israeli camp is that they start to believe their own propaganda. I just wanted to make another point about the human shields argument. It's something that Israel raises time and time again. In fact, it raised it at the time in the Operation Cast-led assault on Gaza, and Amnesty International investigated and found that, in fact, there was no evidence that Palestinians used their civilians as human shields. In fact, it was the Israelis who used Palestinians as human shields. So all the evidence is that it is actually Israelis who do that. And in fact, in 2005, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that the Israeli military had to stop using Palestinian civilians as human shields, and the Israeli Defense Establishment objected to that ruling. The evidence speaks for itself. Reasonable, rational people will look at this situation. They will see an occupying power. So when Israel rains down all of these bombs and shells and artillery on the Gazan population with a warning that they should flee, where do they flee to? Where can they go? Can people conceive of that people are being bombed on with nowhere to go, nowhere to flee?
Let me ask Dr. Weiser that. Is there an Israeli position, Dr. Weiser, on where the Palestinians in this disputed territory would or should go?
Sure. Every time that they drop the leaflets, it's not just a leaflet to get out of your house, it's a leaflet to go down this street, to turn into this area, and that area is then untouched. Look, since 2005, Israel left Gaza. For 9 years, instead of building hospitals, instead of building schools, instead of building kindergartens, with all the world aid that came into Gaza, what did Hamas build? It built those kilometres and kilometres of concrete-supported tunnels so that it could go under the border towards Israel so it could perpetrate mega-terror attacks. They haven't used the equipment, the aid, the medicines, the food that Israel sends in. And by the way, one has to ask a very serious question. It's not Israel that controls all the border of Gaza. After all, Hamas's Arab friends, Egypt, control a very large part of the border with Gaza. And one has to ask, why is it that Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Jordan have all taken a position that Hamas is a danger to the Palestinian people and to the Palestinian cause? Hamas's ideology is total destruction of Israel. When Hamas's ideology, or when the Palestinians will elect a leadership that says, let's share the area, then we can have peace. Until such time, there isn't going to be peace, unfortunately, because Hamas won't allow its people to live in peace.
Randy, you hear those comments, and MG, myself and Paige in the studio are hearing both of you speak. We're not
so passionate too.
But sometimes no one's right and wrong. It's just the way it is. But you need to get on. You need to be able to get along to make the whole world live. Can you ever see, Randa, a situation where that's going to happen between you guys?
Yes, I can, because we have the weight of international law in our favour. Over 65 United Nations resolutions calling for that Israel is in violation of. I mean, it's clear under international law that the Palestinians are under illegal military occupation. The peace process has been a farce because as much as Palestinians have been willing to compromise, settlements continue to be built illegally in the West Bank, which makes the possibility of a separate state for Palestinians impossible. And I do see that one day Israel will become so isolated by its violence and by its horrific actions against the Palestinians that the international community will eventually hold it to account. And I just want to quickly make a point. The fact that Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the Arab League have sided with Israel on this particular occasion, that just shows that Egypt and the Arab League and Saudi Arabia are once again just the pawns of the US. That doesn't give us any consolation, the fact that the Arab world can be bought so easily.
Either it's a victimhood thing and you're a victim of every government in the world, or let's face it, the majority of the Arab world today has come to the agreement or the understanding that there should be a two-state solution. When Hamas gets on board with that, the violence will end.
Yeah, but there was a unity government proposed in April this year, and it meant that Hamas would compromise and it would agree to all previous agreements. It would renounce terror, recognise Israel, continue negotiations. Israel refused. Israel was outraged. It refused to recognise that unity government. So what is Hamas to do? Honestly, tell us how you expect us to resist your occupation.
I can tell you what Hamas should do. Hamas should stop firing missiles. That's it.
I'm sorry, but this rockets narrative is rubbish because, in fact, we just hear about it when Palestinians shoot rockets. We don't hear about all the violations by Israel, all the intrusions and incursions by the army into Gaza. the shootings by troops, attacks on fishermen working off the Gaza coast. That's not sexy enough for the media. Only the
Israeli troops have not been in Gaza for years. They went in now only after a week of restraint, by the way, after absorbing thousands of missiles from Hamas, and only after Hamas refused to stop firing those missiles and broke 4 ceasefires, broken by the Egyptians. Only after that did Israel send in ground troops, and the ground troops have been withdrawn now.
I'm talking about ceasefires in the past. The evidence is that it is Israel that has the track record for breaking a ceasefire with bombing. Well, because that's
no evidence
you're on blind bubble. You don't listen to the evidence. You're not interested in the evidence.
The world doesn't listen to that evidence. The world believes that Hamas started this.
The world is
President
doing
Obama.
what's happening.
President
You're
Obama.
in a lone camp now, Ron. You need to understand. You're on.
I don't know what happened. She says you're on the wrong side of history. And then I say President Obama, Prime Minister Cameron, and so on and so forth, all support the state of Israel. And she says the whole world's on the wrong side of history. So, and then she gets very agitated. I don't actually know why that part doesn't work, but
The Triple M Grill Team.
we're not going to play that again. So the point of it is that
They also said how passionate you guys were.
yeah, they said how passionate. That's correct. So the point is that for instance, I said myself something that was backfired on me there. One particular thing that I said again that evening somewhere else, and I haven't repeated that again because it's impossible to make a case for that. The only 1,800 have been killed. I mean, the point of what I was trying to make was that if you drop that amount of ordnance, you know, that so few people died, but that's not a point you can actually make. So I've stopped making that point. But the thing is that, and it's a shame, the last 30 seconds for some reason isn't playing. But some of you have heard it before. She really loses it. She gets really agitated, and she goes on like, well, you know, everyone's against Israel, then everyone's against the Palestinians and whatever. Afterwards, we spent 40 minutes with these guys. The intro that they gave, which was that, you know, then Israel took 55%, they apologised for because they said, look, we know nothing about the topic. We went on the internet, the first website we found, we just copied off the first intro, and that's what we played. On the way out, Brendan, the producer of the show, spent a long time with us, and he said, you know, and I was worried when he said this, but he said that, you know, every day I get tweets, photos from the Palestinians of dead bodies, and I thought he was going to ask me about, like, you know, the usual question, and he said, and I say to myself, and I said, I've said to them, why do they do this? Do they have no respect for these bodies? Do they not care about relatives of these people? To which, you know, I was able to say, they worship death and we worship life. So, it depends. You have to tailor, you don't have to mark this, but you have to tailor your message to the audience that you're listening to. Triple M, a young audience, not knowing about the information, just trying to get the message. In my view, calm, sharing, relatively calm, sharing, peace, we want to make a deal, that sort of message, which is not coming from the other side. Different people will handle advocacy differently. But it's something that, if you want to be an advocate, firstly, you actually do have to be able to believe in what you're advocating. Because if you're not sincere, that will come through. So if you can't get on board with the advocacy message, be an educator, but don't be an advocate. I mean, you can make that decision yourselves. But if you're troubled about being an advocate because of certain things, talk to people who do think they might have an answer or an explanation or whatever, because it is extremely important. I tried to show you with Julie Bishop as an example that advocacy is important for what you said right at the beginning, for Israel to merely exist, not to our enemies, our friends. We have to keep convincing our friends that we are just, moral, doing and we need to convince ourselves, because if we don't, we'll lose the next generation.
I'm sorry that I'm coming back to education, but that's the field that I'm coming from. And the problem is that some of the educators in Jewish schools don't get the right advocacy and the right message to the students, and that's dangerous.
So I would agree with you 100%, but the question we have to ask is, what do we do about it, right? And the answer, or at least an answer, is that, firstly, not ostracizing those people, not castigating those people, certainly not publicly embarrassing those people, But I mean, each of you are either teachers or senior teachers or even headmasters or heads of departments trying to take these people aside, ask what troubles you, what ails you. Understand also that the offhand comment of a person can have a tremendous effect on the students that they're communicating with. And students can see through insincerity. I mean, kids can see through insincerity without any trouble at all. Body language is extremely important. That's why I was trying to say about the Emma Alberici interview. So, of course, from our point of view, where we are trying to, I'm talking about the Science Federation and so forth, and other communal organisations are trying to put you can call it spin, if you have to, but are trying to put the positive view of Israel out there. We will not succeed if we don't have the community behind us. And we will not succeed if the biggest incubator of the next generation, which are the students, are not with us. We have a paradox that most of our kids are in Jewish day schools. Look, you know, if they're anything like my kids, they grew up in a Jewish majority. Till the end of year 12, everybody in our street's Jewish in Sydney. They went to a Jewish day school, they went to a youth movement. God forbid, you know, they're all girls. God forbid those princesses should ever have to catch a public bus. So they were driven to school. You know, when did they meet the rest of the population? They get to university, or they finish school, all of a sudden they see the wider, well, no, they don't need to be advocates standing up there having a debate with 1,000 other students. But that's when they get questioned internally. They start to question themselves. And if we didn't give them the tools till the end of the Bagrut, till the end of the high school, that are going to help them answer why what the basic narrative of Israel is positive, moral and just, we're going to lose them. So it's great responsibility for us, recognising though that advocacy and education doesn't mean they can't mix, right? But if we, in a sense, if we can't turn out advocates, we have to question whether the whole purpose of Jewish day school education was worthwhile. And that's a question we're going to have to deal with as a community as time goes on. But I would argue that this recent conflict has been the easiest, the most black and white, to have a clear advocacy moral position. And that at those times, or in these times, we don't have to stand in front of kids or the community and be troubled. We might have troubles about, you know, one of the topics I'm going to deal with tomorrow, settlements or something, but this is nothing like that. And here's a perfect opportunity for us to take our kids and to try and encourage them with advocacy to them as to why they can be actually proud of the state of Israel and proud of the actions of the Jewish people, rather than by the Randa's questions and you know, she's a lawyer. In my view, I consciously took a decision in this interview not to talk anything about international law. You know, international, I mean, really, we're going to have an argument about law? I mean, first, I'm not a lawyer, but secondly, so what? She says this one, they say another one. It's not the ikar, it's not the central point, in my view, of the message we're trying to get across. But again, I think a sharing, caring, wanting to exist peacefully with everybody else message said in a calm manner works much better. And when we get diverted by saying that other people are worse, it doesn't work for us. It's true, but it doesn't work for us. So what if other people are worse? Did I say better before? Anyway, so what if other people are worse? It's terrible. But, you know, we need to be able to justify to ourselves that what we're doing is fitting within, you know, Amos Oz, and I'll finish with this, he did a great interview, and this is when you talk about unity. You know, he was interviewed by a German paper, and the paper said to him, you know, he said, before you interview me, I've got to ask you 2 questions. Some of you have seen that, right? One is, I'm sitting on my balcony, my neighbour's sitting on the balcony across the road with his kid in his lap, and he starts shooting a machine gun at me. What should I do? Second question, I'm at my nursery in my house, he's got his nursery, they dig a tunnel underneath. What should I do? The heading of the article was that what Israel did was extensive. What was the word? I don't know, excessive. That was the word. What Israel did was excessive, and he says, that's what Amos said, and then he said, but justified. It's very powerful when it comes from Amos Oz and not from Avigdor Lieberman. And I think that if Amos Oz can come to this sort of understanding of the situation, we should be able to try and convey that to the people around us as well. Thank you.